For many, jazz can sound so different than a lot of other genres. And I think it's got this stigma around it that it's difficult or that it just requires a lot of practice. And so I think a lot of guitar players end up writing it off. I mean, it's not like you're going to be playing Shadow of Your Smile at some big show, so why let it interrupt your rock star dreams? But jazz can be incredibly gratifying to learn, and it'll improve all aspects of your musicality. A lot of the times with students, I'll tell them that actors or thespians may study Shakespeare into the dirt, but very few of them go on to become Shakespearean actors. But it's the history that can inform the present, and I think we're seeing a lot more of that jazz influence in popular music right now. So let's talk about getting started in jazz as a guitar player. Jazz can be a pretty diverse subject, so we're going to stick to what's called straight ahead jazz. Straight ahead jazz is what you kind of hear when you go to a restaurant and they've got a jazz group playing. Typically, it can include any number of instrumentalists, from guitarists to bassists to euphonium players to even musical saw. This type of jazz is based around playing tunes from the Great American Songbook, which is just a collection of songs that are from older musicals or just older well-known songs that got a little bit of a jazz treatment to it. So seventh chords, different feel. A lot of the times there's some reharmonizations or maybe extended sections. The songbook you may hear a lot about is what's called the real book. And there's actually some really interesting origins to this real book. Some kind of shady and unlawful. I'd recommend checking out the book The Story of Fake Books Bootlegging Songs to Musicians if you want to hear the full story. It's really interesting. Now, so you might think, whoa, so jazz is just the same number of finite songs played over and over again. Doesn't that get a little stale? Well, first of all, it's not uncommon to see a new original song introduced into the set list. In fact, that's pretty welcome from my experience. But what keeps the finite American songbook tunes so fresh is the fact that so much of it is based around improvisation. The only thing you really memorize when you're playing jazz is the head. And the head is the melody that you think of when you think of the song. It's usually a 16 or 32 bar melody. So for example, this is My Favorite Things, done by John Coltrane in a jazz context. So you've got the head, now you need to know the associated harmony that the melody and the solos are going to be based off of. These are the chords, or what jazz musicians would call changes, and these are the foundational harmony blocks by which our solos are going to be based off of. Speaking of soloing, most musicians, when you're playing straight ahead jazz, will take a solo. A lot of these solos are based on licks, but actually when you're playing jazz, licks are referred to as lines. So these lines are actually taken from other jazz musicians' solos. And this process of kind of interpreting other lines from other musicians and incorporating them into your own improvisation, this is called transcribing. Here's an example of a great jazz line that I lifted from the song Donna Lee. Jazz solos are also based around playing the changes and mainly playing the arpeggios of the chords going by, rather than just playing a singular scale. So approaching a C major 7 may look a lot more like this, rather than that. An arpeggio is just simply an elaboration of the chord, playing the chord tones. When improvising solos, you play choruses. Now, playing a chorus means you're just improvising over the form. Now, that form could be 16 or 32 bars, or it could be 12 bars, kind of like a blues. Jazz actually has a ton of blues influence, or maybe blues has a ton of jazz influence. If you've ever listened to players like Josh Smith or Robin Ford, you know that that line can be blurred. But sticking to more straight ahead, jazz actually has its own variation of a 12-bar blues that navigates the harmony in a more complex way, a couple more chords involved. Let me play it for you. So why was I playing the chords like that in the example? Because I wasn't really strumming through them. I was playing a lot more percussively. Well, that's because the idea of rhythm guitar doesn't really exist in jazz. Really what you're doing is you're doing this thing called comping. That's short for accompanying. Comping has its own complexities on its own, but really you're just kind of filling gaps. And careful not to get too crazy or you might get kicked off the bandstand. A simple and always accepted way of comping is to play Freddie Green style. This is the way that Freddie Green played his guitar when he was playing with the Count Basie Orchestra, and it's basically just playing quarter notes. These quarter notes actually help the band swing harder. But now what is swing? Well, swing comes down to the eighth note. Playing eighth notes with a metronome, you're probably subdividing in a straight way. But swung eighths are based on a triplet feel, basically more like da-ga-da-ga-da-ga-da-ga, triplet, 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 triplet. You've probably got a feel for swing already because it's pretty common in rock and even punk music. Now there are some alternate genres that are accepted into the jazz world that are played more straight. Genres like bossa nova and samba that are from Brazil. There's also a lot of Latin genres that are very common. Jazz also branches out into some interesting genres like modal or free jazz, if you ever find yourself checking out the bigger history. Now we have to talk about sound and tone. Jazz guitar is typically played on a big hollow body, something like a Gibson L5, an ES-175, or guitars made by Boris, Benedetto. They're usually very high-end guitars, and jazz players will refer to these as jazz boxes. They're designed and crafted to get a really round tone with detail and sustain. Semi-hollow guitars, like an ES-335, are pretty common, as are Telecasters and the occasional Les Paul. You won't hear much by way of overdrive in straight-ahead guitar, though. You might hear it in fusion or maybe some avant-garde big band music like by Maria Schneider. Straight ahead is primarily clean, usually with just a touch of reverb, and I see some preference towards Fender amps like twin reverbs, Fiberluxes. Some guitars are playing solid state amps now too. I see a big preference going towards Quilter amps because they're lightweight. A sound you're going to hear often is the sound of the tone knob being rolled off all the way. This gets you a very mid-range forward tone with no high end. It can sound nice and warm and punchy sometimes. I've never been much of a fan of that sound, but Pat Metheny is a master of it. Something else that Pat Metheny does that not a lot of other jazz guitarists do is articulate with slides and bends. From what I've experienced, a lot of jazz guitarists don't tend to bend strings or do dramatic slides. You might hear a sidestep. A lot of the times they won't even use vibrato. This sound I would equate to trying to sound how a piano would sound, especially with the tendency of guitar players to want to pick every note when they're playing jazz. Articulating like that may get you closer to sounding like a jazz guitarist, but rules are always meant to be broken. One cool thing about guitars in jazz is that guitars are really the only instrument that play together regularly. You may occasionally see something like a piano duel or maybe two saxophonists playing a duet, but you can regularly see two guitarists playing jazz as a duo. That's because guitar has the nice benefit of being able to play the chords and the lead. That's not something that every instrument can do. So what we talked about in this video is really just scratching the surface of jazz. You never really master jazz, and so it ends up becoming a lifelong pursuit for many musicians. There is a very simple way of getting really good at jazz though, and that is transcribe a lot. Lift a bunch of licks from your favorite players and play them over tunes. Just do that a bunch and you'll sound great in no time. Now, if you need something to practice over, the backing track that I used in this video is available on my Patreon. That's patreon.com/Daniel McLaughlin. This track is available there, as well as a bunch of other backing tracks from my previous videos. And hey, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you leave me a like, and I'll see you guys in the next one.